He began responding in kind, arranging her posture, testing her responses, and discovering that his manipulations seemed to elicit a feedback, a deliberate and knowing adjustment on her part. It was a dialogue without words, a connection that defied the boundaries of animate and inanimate, conscious and unconscious. Edward began to notice changes within himself, beyond mere obsession. His reflection was dimmer, his gaze more hollow. He would glance into mirrors and swear that the doll's eyes flickered back at him, mocking or measuring, reminding him of some debt he had yet to comprehend. At times, he imagined that the whispers were taking form, coiling about him in the darkness, insinuating themselves into his thoughts, until he could not discern where the doll ended and he began. And yet, he could not stop. The allure of Seraphine was total, absolute. Every glance, every subtle movement, every whisper in the night drew him deeper into a spiral of fascination and dread. He began to fear what he might discover, even as he longed to probe the final boundaries of her influence. One morning, he found her standing upright upon the floor of the attic. No mechanism, no string, no hidden prop could account for it. She faced him directly, eyes glimmering, and Edward felt the undeniable conviction that she had moved deliberately, had chosen the moment to assert her presence. A shiver ran through him, not entirely of fear, but of recognition, that the balance of power had shifted, and he was no longer master of the manor, of the attic, or even of his own will. He understood, in that instant, the pattern of the lineage chronicled in the diary. His aunt, and all who had come before, had been drawn inexorably into her orbit. And now, he was bound to the same course, the same inexorable pull that had consumed those who dared linger too long in her presence. The whispers had become commands, the subtle movements now explicit, and Edward knew with a cold certainty that the doll's gaze was no longer passive. It was active. It was deliberate. And it was patient. Edward Ravenscroft, alone in the attic with Seraphine, felt the final threads of his rational world unravel. The nights would henceforth belong to her, the hours of wakefulness to obsession, the boundaries of self to the uncanny intelligence that had claimed him. And as he fell asleep that night, he felt, for the first time, that he might not awaken in the same manner as before, for the doll had begun to whisper more insistently, to beckon more clearly, to claim more definitively the portion of him that had hitherto resisted. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning illuminating the twisted trees, the blackened towers of Ravenscroft Manor, and the attic window where a small figure stood silently, eyes reflecting more than light, more than curiosity. They reflected the first glimmers of domination. And within, Edward lay in restless slumber, dreams entwined with whispers, with movements, with eyes that followed him in every shadow, in every corner, in every heart. Thus began the true descent, the surrender to the whispers, the acknowledgement of the gaze, and the slow erasure of Edward Ravenscroft from the world of men into a domain ruled by Seraphine, the doll who watched, who waited, and who remembered. The days and nights at Ravenscroft Manor had long since blended into one another, indistinguishable and unyielding. The manor, once merely a residence, had become a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and haunted spaces, all suffused with the omnipresence of Seraphine. Edward moved through it with a strange, haunted rhythm, his thoughts consumed entirely by the doll and the intricate mystery of her existence. Each moment not devoted to her study was a theft against himself, an act of denial that he could scarcely endure. He spent hours arranging her upon the cushions of the attic, adjusting the tilt of her head, the slight bend of her wrists, the minuscule positioning of her porcelain fingers. Each arrangement elicited a subtle response, a shift, a quiver, a tilt that seemed deliberate, conscious. Edward catalogued these meticulously, filling notebooks with sketches, observations, and notes on her behavior, as though her will could be read in the lines and angles of her form. Yet he knew, deep within the marrow of his consciousness, that she was aware of his scrutiny, and that awareness alone held power over him. The servants who had survived the early days of his presence abandoned the house one by one. Doors refused to open for them. Chandeliers swayed without wind, and shadows clung to the walls in ways that left them pale and trembling. Edward no longer noticed their absence, for the doll had become both his company and his world. He spoke to her aloud now, a strange soliloquy of devotion and inquiry. "Seraphine, what do you see in me? What do you take? How far does your gaze reach?" No answer came, not in words, but in the subtle, inexorable responses he had learned to interpret. The tilt of her head, the slight curl of a hand, the glint of her eyes that seemed to pierce the very recesses of his mind. In these moments, Edward felt a thrill mingled with dread, a recognition that his own life was now entwined irrevocably with hers. Mirrors betrayed him. His reflection grew paler with each passing day, his eyes hollowing as though some essential spark of vitality had been siphoned toward the porcelain figure. At first, he attributed the change to fatigue and obsession, yet the evidence became undeniable. Shadows of his own making seemed to flicker across surfaces before he arrived, anticipating his movements, bending and shifting as though alive. The distinction between his reflection and the doll's gaze blurred, and sometimes he could swear that in the glass he glimpsed Seraphine's eyes, glimmering with satisfaction at his waning vitality. Edward's health began to deteriorate. Meals lost their taste, and he neglected them entirely at times, engrossed in the cataloging of her features, the study of her posture, the delicate adjustments of her gown and hair. His pulse weakened, his hands shook with the effort of endless observation, yet he persisted. Each day brought a new discovery, subtle changes in her form that suggested intelligence beyond the mere artistry of the human hand. One evening, while inspecting a small crack along the porcelain of her wrist, Edward discovered a hidden compartment, cleverly concealed beneath the fabric of her gown. Within it lay tiny objects, fragments of trinkets and letters, each inscribed with the names of previous owners. The dates stretched back decades, some nearing a century in age. He traced the faint engravings with a trembling finger, realizing with horror and fascination that each token represented a life claimed, a soul bound in some manner to the doll's presence. A sudden movement of the doll made him start. Seraphine's head had tilted, and her eyes gleamed in the dim candlelight as though acknowledging his discovery. Edward felt a thrill of recognition mingled with terror. He understood now with undeniable clarity that she did not merely watch, she remembered. Every soul that had ever succumbed to her influence remained inscribed within her being, an eternal gallery of fascination and ruin. From that moment, Edward's obsession deepened to the point of delirium. He ceased attempts at sleep, remaining in the attic through the long shadowed hours of night, speaking to the doll, recording her movements, tracing the history of her lineage through the tokens she preserved. He sketched her form repeatedly, until the pages of his notebooks were filled with the delicate curves of her porcelain hands, the folds of her frayed gown, the haunting depth of her eyes. Each sketch seemed to draw him further into her orbit, a tether pulling him away from the world of men and toward a domain entirely ruled by her presence. He began to hear voices beyond the whispers he had come to know. At first, faint, almost imperceptible, then gradually louder, clearer, as though the very walls of the manor were speaking through her. The whispers were indistinguishable in origin, sometimes emanating from the attic itself, sometimes from the corridors far below. They murmured secrets, fragments of memories, insinuations of events long past. Edward recognized them as the voices of the doll's previous owners, echoing through time, trapped within her essence, and now joined by his own trembling consciousness. The manor responded to the increasing intensity of his obsession. Doors creaked and groaned on their own. Candles flickered without cause, and shadows gathered in corners, stretching in impossible directions. Sometimes he saw fleeting shapes in the periphery of his vision. The tall, thin silhouette of a man whose face he could not discern, or the fleeting presence of a child, invisible yet unmistakably real. He began to understand that the house itself had become complicit, an extension of the doll's will, shaping its halls and rooms to facilitate the capture of those ensnared by her gaze. Edward no longer ventured beyond the attic except when necessary, and even then he returned quickly, compelled by an invisible force. He became a creature of obsession, moving like a specter through the house, speaking softly to the doll, responding to the subtle signals she provided. The diary of his aunt lay open before him constantly, offering clues, guidance, and warning. Yet he read it obsessively, almost ritualistically, for he sensed that understanding was the only way to maintain a tenuous hold on his own mind. Beyond, the villagers' warnings took on a prophetic resonance. Their whispers, once dismissed as superstition, now rang true with uncanny precision. It watches, it waits, it remembers. Each phrase echoed in Edward's mind like a solemn chant, a dirge that accompanied every thought, every movement. He understood now that the doll's power was cumulative, growing with each soul it ensnared, and that his own surrender would only strengthen her dominion. One night, Edward awoke to find the doll seated upon his chest, porcelain face mere inches from his own. The candle had guttered and died, leaving them both in darkness, save for the pale luminescence of her glass eyes. He could feel the faint pressure of her weight, impossibly heavy for something so small, and the air between them vibrated with an intelligence both seductive and terrifying. "Edward," he whispered, voice trembling, "what do you want of me?" No response came, yet he felt the weight of her answer. And she demanded his attention, his obsession, his very essence. She required his surrender, a gift of self that he felt compelled to offer, even as fear and reason screamed against it. In the days that followed, Edward's decline accelerated. His reflection in mirrors became a faint echo, ghostly and insubstantial. Shadows clung to his form, whispering in tongues he did not fully understand. He neglected sustenance entirely, speaking and moving only to attend to the doll, to record her every nuance, to obey the subtle imperatives of her gaze. He knew now that he was no longer a master, but a participant in a ritual older than memory. A chain of fascination and ruin that stretched through the decades. And still, he could not resist her. The allure of Seraphine was total, absolute. Her glassy eyes commanded him with a power beyond logic, beyond understanding. Every night he returned to the attic. Every day he lingered in her presence, drawn deeper into the intricate web of obsession she wove with each tilt of her head, each subtle quiver of her porcelain hand. Edward Ravenscroft had become a creature of the doll's making, a vessel of devotion and terror. He understood with a clarity that terrified him that there would be no return to the world beyond Ravenscroft Manor. Seraphine had claimed him entirely, not merely his attention, but the essence of his being. The descent was complete when, outside, the wind howled through the twisted trees, carrying with it the echoes of past whispers and the faintest hints of laughter. Within, in the shadowed attic, the doll waited, her gaze steady, patient, eternal, and Edward, pale and trembling, knelt before her, surrendering to the knowledge that he was now but another soul, ensnared, another name whispered in the lineage of the damned. Thus, the collector became the collected, the observer became the observed, and the descent into obsession reached its apex, for Ravenscroft Manor was no longer merely a house. It was a tomb, a sanctuary, and a stage for the eternal dominion of the doll who watched, who waited, and who remembered. The storm had arrived with the fury of a world undone. Rain pounded against the leaded windows of Ravenscroft Manor, lightning slicing across the sky in jagged brilliance, illuminating the twisted towers and the ivy-clad walls with stark, unnatural clarity. The wind rattled the shutters and howled through the broken panes, carrying with it the sound of distant, unseen lamentations. Within the manor, the atmosphere was equally charged, a tension that seemed to press upon the walls and ceilings, and most keenly upon the attic where Seraphine awaited her devotee. Edward Ravenscroft had become unrecognizable from the man who had first arrived at the estate. His pallor was nearly spectral, his eyes hollow yet alight with feverish fascination, his hands trembling from neglect, obsession, and the inexorable pull of the doll. Days had passed without proper sustenance or rest. Nights had been consumed entirely by whispered conversations, subtle adjustments, and endless scrutiny of Seraphine's porcelain perfection. Yet he did not pause, could not pause. The compulsion had become absolute. That night, as the storm raged most fiercely, Edward ascended to the attic, candle in hand. He found the doll not upon her usual cushion, but standing in the center of the room. Her feet were impossibly poised, the gown swaying faintly as if caught in a breeze that existed only within the confines of the room. Her eyes, those glassy, endless eyes, gleamed with intelligence, awareness, and intent. Edward's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of awe, dread, and recognition coursing through him. "Shh, you," he murmured, voice trembling. "You move." Seraphine did not answer, yet the shift in her presence was enough. Edward felt it as a tangible pressure, a pull upon his consciousness. Every step he took toward her was measured, deliberate, as if drawn by some invisible tether. The candlelight flickered, shadows twisting along the walls like elongated fingers, creating grotesque silhouettes that seemed almost animate. Then he saw it, the faintest quiver of her lips. A whisper, soft as the rustling of dead leaves, drifted into his mind. "Edward," he staggered backward, heart hammering. The attic seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in rhythm with his terror. Lightning flashed, illuminating the small figure with stark clarity, and in that instant, Edward understood fully. Seraphine's dominion had reached its apex. She was no longer a mere object of fascination. She was a force, ancient and patient, consuming his attention, his will, and now his very essence. Edward fell to his knees before her. What do you want of me?" he whispered, voice raw. Why do you claim me?" The room responded in subtle ways. The shadows deepened, the rafters groaned, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with intelligence. Seraphine tilted her head, and Edward felt a presence pressing against him, delicate yet overwhelming. A sensation of being seen, measured, and found lacking. The whispers from previous owners, long dead, long claimed, joined with the pressure, murmuring in unison, a symphony of surrender and despair. And then, the impossible happened. The doll stepped forward. Porcelain feet, impossibly light, moved with precision and deliberation across the floorboards. Edward froze, terror and fascination warring within him. Each movement of hers was deliberate, measured, and utterly alive. The storm outside roared, lightning illuminating the scene in stark flashes. The doll, no longer confined to her cushion, advancing with intent. Edward trembling, caught between flight and surrender. "She waits," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "She has always waited." A gust of wind blew through the broken attic windows, extinguishing his candle. Darkness enveloped the room, yet Edward could still feel her presence, moving, circling, alive. The whispers intensified, rising to a crescendo that seemed to reverberate within his very bones. He stumbled backward, hands outstretched, but there was nowhere to retreat. The attic had become a chamber of inevitability, the boundaries of space reshaped by her will. Then he felt it. The pressure, delicate yet insistent, against his chest. He could not see it, yet he knew with absolute certainty that Seraphine was there, upon him, claiming him in ways beyond comprehension. Ow! His knees gave way, and he fell prone to the floor, mind racing, breath shallow. Every thought, every memory, every fragment of identity seemed drawn outward, funneled toward her porcelain gate. He realized with horror that he was becoming part of the lineage she preserved, a soul to be recorded, remembered, and in some ineffable manner, preserved within her being. Edward screamed. A sound that seemed swallowed by the storm echoed back at him, distorted, as if the house itself had become a mirror of his terror. Lightning struck the manor's towers, sending a jolt of light through the rafters, illuminating the attic in blinding flashes. He glimpsed her, standing upon him motionless, yet infinitely alive, eyes glimmering with satisfaction. The whispers coalesced into a single resounding cadence, a declaration of dominion. And then he saw it, his own reflection in the doll's eyes. Not merely the pallid, hollow image he had become, but the very essence of his self, captured, absorbed, and bound. The realization struck him with terrible clarity. He was no longer merely the observer. He had become observed, consumed, and eternally preserved within the gaze of Seraphine. The storm's fury increased, lightning striking the manor again and again, shaking its foundations. The attic shuddered with each blast, the walls groaning, the rafters moaning. Edward felt the last threads of his will dissolve, every instinct of self-preservation subsumed by the irresistible force of the doll's presence. He tried to cry out, to resist, but the voice would not form, the breath would not rise. His body, trembling and pallid, became a vessel, a conduit through which the doll's dominion extended fully. And then the fire came. A bolt of lightning struck the roof of Ravenscroft Manor, igniting the dry timbers and setting the house ablaze. Flames licked the walls, consuming paintings, furniture, and trinkets with insatiable hunger. Smoke filled the corridors, choking the air, yet the attic remained a chamber of impossible clarity. Seraphine, untouched by flame or heat, stood amidst the growing inferno, her gaze fixed, unyielding, triumphant. Edward felt himself lifted, or perhaps drawn inward, toward the porcelain perfection of the doll. He could not tell if he moved toward her or she toward him. The distinction had ceased to matter. Every fragment of his being, memory, thought, desire, terror, was funneled into that small, perfect form. And then, with a final, shuddering awareness, he understood. He had surrendered entirely, body, mind, and soul, to the eternal dominion of Seraphine. Outside, the manor burned, a conflagration that consumed centuries of history. Yet within the attic, untouched and inviolate, the doll remained. Porcelain face immaculate, glassy eyes gleaming with knowledge, intelligence, and satisfaction. She bore witness to the fire, the chaos, and the surrender. She had claimed another, added another soul to the lineage preserved within her gaze, and waited patiently for the next who would dare linger too long in her presence. And in that quiet triumph, amidst the roar of flames and the fury of the storm, Edward Ravenscroft ceased to exist in the world of men. He was preserved, immortalized within Seraphine's gaze, another whisper in her lineage of fascination and ruin. The storm raged on, the fire devoured the manor, yet she remained, eternal, watchful, and insatiably patient. The doll's embrace was complete. Years had passed since the flames of Ravenscroft Manor had devoured its darkened halls and shattered towers. Yet Seraphine endured. She had survived fire, storm, and the slow erosion of time, emerging unscathed. Her porcelain features untouched, her glassy eyes luminous with the intelligence and memory of countless souls. The world had changed around her, yet she remained, a sentinel of fascination and terror, awaiting the next to dare meet her gaze. She now resided within a quiet, musty gallery in the heart of London, part of a private collection of curiosities and oddities. The gallery's owner, a man of refined taste and a penchant for the arcane, had acquired her at auction, unaware of the full depth of her history. He displayed her carefully, seated upon a velvet cushion beneath a glass dome, the soft illumination of a lamp accentuating her lifelike features. Visitors admired her delicacy, her craftsmanship, her eerie beauty, but few remained long enough to notice the subtle awareness that lingered within her gaze. Yet those who did, an artist, a collector, a scholar, spoke afterward of a sensation they could not explain. A shiver, a prickle of unease, a whisper of recognition in the depths of her eyes. Some claimed to see reflections not their own, figures that shimmered and shifted when no one else was present. A few whispered of hearing names, faintly breathed across the silence of the gallery, as if Seraphine had been speaking to them, claiming them, even from beneath the glass dome. The gallery's curator had come to respect her as he would a rare and fragile artifact, careful not to disturb her in ways that might provoke something. He noticed how visitors' eyes lingered longer than they should, how an inexplicable compulsion drew them nearer, as if they were being studied as much as they were studying the doll. Once, he found a notebook tucked beneath the velvet cushion, a journal filled with meticulous sketches, observations, and trembling script. It bore the name Edward Ravenscroft, along with detailed accounts of movements, postures, and subtle expression. He shivered, sensing a presence behind the words, an intelligence that transcended paper and ink. Indeed, Edward's essence remained within Seraphine. The doll's eyes contained the faintest glimmer of awareness, a spectral echo of his mind, preserved alongside the others who had succumbed to her dominion. In quiet moments, alone in the gallery, Edward's reflection could be glimpsed, superimposed upon the doll's gaze, an eternal observer trapped within porcelain and paint. He whispered in silence, a voice that could be heard only by those who lingered too long, those whose curiosity flirted dangerously with obsession. One evening, a young artist arrived at the gallery, drawn by tales of an unusual and exquisite doll. She approached Seraphine's display, her fingers lingering near the glass, eyes wide with fascination. The doll's gaze met hers, and something subtle passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. The whispers began, almost imperceptibly, curling around the artist's mind like smoke. Stay, observe, linger. Hours passed unnoticed. The artist sketched Seraphine, recording every delicate curve, the folds of her gown, the glint of her eyes. Yet, with each stroke of the pencil, she felt a strange lightness, a pull toward the porcelain figure that she could not resist. Unseen by the curator, her reflection shimmered in the glass dome, faint but unmistakable, as if another consciousness observed her through the eyes of the doll. The gallery remained quiet, the city alive outside, oblivious to the subtle machinations within the small, dimly lit room. Seraphine sat immobile, serene, yet infinitely aware. Every movement of the visitor, every glance, every breath was noted, absorbed, woven into the tapestry of consciousness she had collected over decades. Edward, preserved within her gaze, whispered guidance and subtle encouragement, a silent accomplice in the ongoing ritual of fascination. Those who lingered too long reported strange dreams afterward. Dreams of corridors that stretched impossibly, of small figures watching from dark corners, of whispers that spoke their names. Artists awoke with sketches of impossible precision, scholars with insights too vivid to be natural. Yet all felt a subtle emptiness, a sense of part of themselves claimed, as if some invisible tether had been drawn into a space they could not name. The gallery's visitors came and went, unaware of the silent witness in their midst. Seraphine remained, patient and eternal, a sentinel of fascination, of obsession, of ruin. She was a collector of souls, a preserver of consciousness, a presence that transcended time and decay. Edward's mind lingered within her, neither alive nor dead, a whisper among whispers, a reflection within reflections. And so the lineage continued. Each who dared meet her gaze, who lingered too long, risked surrendering their own essence to the porcelain perfection before them. The cycle persisted, patient and unending. In the quietest hours of the night, when the gallery was empty, the lamp cast a soft glow over Seraphine's features. Her eyes shimmered, glinting with intelligence and intent. Edward's reflection flickered within them, his voice a whisper on the edge of perception. Observe, remember, wait. And somewhere, perhaps in a distant corridor, a new visitor approached, drawn by the allure of beauty, the fascination of craftsmanship, the subtle, unspoken invitation of the doll who watched, who waited, and who remembered. The museum would never know how many had already been claimed. The doll's collection was eternal, infinite in its patience. And within Seraphine's gaze, the eyes of Edward Ravenscroft, and all who had come before, remained alive, watching, and trapped forever. Thus ends the tale of Edward Ravenscroft and Seraphine, the porcelain doll, whose gaze preserved obsession, whose patience preserved souls, and whose silent dominion endured beyond the fire, beyond time, and beyond mortal comprehension.